I moved into the quaint suburban neighborhood of Maplewood with a sense of relief and hope. After years of city living, the quiet streets and friendly faces felt like a balm to my weary soul. The house I bought was a charming two-story, painted a soft blue, with a white picket fence and a well-tended garden. It was everything I had ever wanted. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked, settled in, and introduced myself to the neighbors. They were polite, but distant, which I attributed to the usual wariness of no people. It wasn't until my first Saturday night that I realized something was amiss. It started around midnight. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it. A long, piercing scream. It sliced through the silence, jolting me upright in bed. My heart raced as I strained to listen, but the scream had faded into the night. I checked the locks and peered out the windows, but everything seemed normal. The neighbors' houses were dark, their occupants seemingly undisturbed. The next morning, I mentioned the scream to Mrs. Thompson, my elderly next-door neighbor. She smiled benignly, but offered no explanation. Just a vague comment about how quiet the neighborhood usually was. Her response only added to my unease. The screams continued, always around midnight. Each time, they seemed closer, more desperate. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just a fox or some other animal. But the sound was unmistakably human. My sleep-deprived mind started to imagine all sorts of horrors lurking in the shadows. One night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, I ventured outside as soon as the scream began. The cold air bit at my skin, and the beam of my flashlight wavered with my trembling hand. I followed the sound, which led me to the backyard of a house 2 doors down from mine. It was the only house on the block with all its lights off. As I approached, the scream abruptly stopped, plunging the night into an eerie silence. My flashlight flickered over the backyard, revealing nothing out of the ordinary, just a neatly kept lawn and a garden shed. I took a deep breath and crept closer to the shed, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the shed door swung open with a creak. I jumped back, nearly dropping the flashlight. A figure stepped out, and I recognized Mr. Owens, the reclusive man who lived in the house. His eyes were wild, and his clothes were disheveled. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice a harsh whisper. I heard a scream. I stared. I thought someone might be in trouble. "There's no scream," he said, his expression hardening. "Go back to your house. This is none of your business." Before I could protest, he slammed the shed door shut and stomped back inside. I stood there, bewildered and frightened, before finally retreating to the safety of my own home. The next day, I decided to confide in Jessica, a young woman who lived across the street. She was friendly and seemed more open than the other neighbors. When I told her about the screams and my encounter with Mr. Owens, her face paled. "You need to be careful," she warned. "There are things in this neighborhood you don't understand. People here, they're not what they seem." "What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "There's a reason why houses here sell so cheaply," she said, glancing around nervously. "There's something wrong with this place. I've heard the screams too, but whenever I try to talk about it, people shut me down. It's like they're all in on some secret." Her words sent a chill down my spine. That night, the scream came again, louder and more frantic than ever. It sounded like it was right outside my window. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back to Mr. Owens' house. This time, I was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. I snuck into the backyard and approached the shed. The door was ajar, and a faint light glowed from within. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The sight that greeted me was worse than any nightmare I could have imagined. The shed was filled with strange symbols painted on the walls in what looked like blood. In the center of the floor was a crude altar, and on it, a woman, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. I rushed to her side and worked frantically to untie her. She was sobbing, trying to speak through her gag. As I freed her, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. I turned to see Mr. Allen standing there, a twisted smile on his face. "You shouldn't have come here," he hissed. "You've ruined everything." I shoved him away and helped the woman to her feet. Together, we ran out of the shed and into the night. The screams had drawn the attention of other neighbors, who were now gathering, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. As the police arrived and took Mr. Owens into custody, I learned the horrifying truth. The neighborhood had a dark history of disappearances, all centered around Mr. Owens and his twisted rituals. The screams I had heard were from his victims, trapped and tortured in that hellish shed. The neighbors' silence and indifference suddenly made sense. They had known, or at least suspected, what was happening, but were too afraid to act. It took an outsider, someone unaware of the unspoken rules, to break the cycle of terror. In the days that followed, the neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. People were more open, more willing to talk. Jessica and I became friends, bonded by our shared ordeal. But even as I settled back into my life, the memory of those screams haunted me. Maplewood had lost its veneer of peace, revealing the darkness that lurked beneath. I still live in that blue house with the white picket fence, but now I keep my windows locked tight at night. The screams have stopped, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I think I hear a faint echo of them, and I wonder if true peace can ever return to a place that has known such horror. Moving into the old apartment building was supposed to be a fresh start for Sarah and me. The place had a certain charm with its vintage architecture and county units, and the rent was surprisingly affordable. We settled into our new home with excitement, unaware of the darkness that lurked within its walls. The building was shaped like a U, with a long, narrow hallway connecting all the units. At the very end of the hall was a door that remained perpetually locked. It was the only door without a number, and it piqued our curiosity from the moment we moved in. The other residents, an odd mix of elderly folks and young professionals, seemed to avoid talking about it. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, Sarah and I were sitting in our living room, enjoying a glass of wine. The conversation naturally drifted to the mysterious door. "Have you noticed how everyone seems to avoid that room at the end of the hall?" Sarah asked, twirling her glass. "Yeah, it's weird. I asked Mrs. Jenkins about it, but she just changed the subject," I replied, feeling a strange sense of unease. "Maybe it's just a storage closet or something," Sarah suggested, but her eyes betrayed her curiosity. We decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of adventure, we made our way down the dimly lit hallway. As we approached the door, the air grew colder and an unsettling silence enveloped us. I tried the handle, but it was locked, as expected. "Looks like a dead end," I said, trying to hide my disappointment. "Wait, what's that?" Sarah pointed to the floor. There was a small, old key lying just outside the doorframe, almost as if it had been placed there deliberately. My heart raced as I picked it up. "Do you think?" "Only one way to find out," Sarah replied, her eyes wide with anticipation. I inserted the key into the lock, and with a click, the door creaked open. A musty smell wafted out, and I shone the flashlight into the darkness. The room was small and cluttered with old furniture covered in white sheets. Dust motes danced in the beam of the flashlight, and the air felt heavy with neglect. Sarah stepped inside, and I followed, closing the door behind us to keep the noise down. As we explored, we found old photographs, yellowed with age, depicting people who seemed to have lived in the building long ago. There was a strange sense of familiarity to the faces, as if they were watching us. In the far corner of the room, we discovered a large, antique mirror. It was ornate and covered in a thick layer of dust. Sarah wiped it with her sleeve, revealing a polished surface that seemed almost new. "Creepy," she whispered, staring at her reflection. I moved closer, and as I looked into the mirror, a chill ran down my spine. Our reflections seemed off. They moved just a fraction of a second out of sync with our own movements. "I don't like this," I said, stepping back. "Me neither. Let's go," Sarah agreed, her voice shaky. We left the room, locking the door behind us and placing the key back where we found it. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My dreams were plagued by images of the mirror and the faces in the photographs. The next few days were uneventful, but the sense of unease grew stronger. Sarah seemed distant, and I often caught her staring blankly at the walls. One night, I woke to find her standing at the end of our bed, her eyes wide open, but unseeing. "Sarah, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room. I followed her down the hallway, my heart pounding. She stopped in front of the locked door, and to my horror, it was ajar. "Sarah, don't," I pleaded, but she stepped inside. I followed her into the room, and as soon as I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. The flashlight flickered, and then went out, plunging us into darkness. I groped for Sarah, but she was gone. "Sarah," I called out, panic rising in my chest. The room felt different. The air was colder, and I could hear a faint whispering, like dozens of voices speaking just beyond the edge of hearing. I fumbled with the flashlight, finally getting it to work. The beam revealed the mirror, now uncovered and glowing with an eerie light. In the mirror, I saw Sarah standing still, her face blank, but around her were the figures from the photographs, their eyes dark and hollow. They moved closer to her, their mouths opening in silent screams. "No," I shouted, rushing to the mirror. I pounded on the glass, but it was solid, cold. Sarah's reflection turned to face me, and her eyes locked onto mine. They were empty, devoid of any recognition. Desperation took over. I grabbed the chair and smashed it against the mirror. The glass shattered, and the room was engulfed in darkness. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. I felt hands grasping at me, pulling me back. I woke up in our apartment, drenched in sweat. Sarah was next to me, sleeping peacefully. I shook her awake, and she looked at me with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice groggy. I think it was a nightmare," I said, my voice trembling. "We shouldn't go back to that room." She nodded, and we tried to go back to sleep, but the sense of dread lingered. The next morning, the door at the end of the hall was gone, replaced by a blank wall. The residents carried on as if nothing had changed, but I knew better. Sarah and I moved out shortly after. We never spoke of the room again, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I see shadows in the corridors of our new home and hear faint whispers. The memory of that room haunts me, a constant reminder of the darkness that lies just beyond the edge of the ordinary. I don't know what became of the room or the spirits trapped within, but I do know one thing: some doors are better left unopened. When I moved into the old Victorian house, I was immediately drawn to the garden next door. It belonged to Mr. Graves, an eccentric old man who seemed to live for his plants. The garden was a riot of colors and textures, with flowers and shrubs that seemed to burst from the earth with an almost unnatural vitality. One sunny afternoon, while unpacking boxes on my porch, Mr. Graves approached me. He was tall and thin, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through me. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said in a deep, gravelly voice. "I am Mr. Graves. If you need any help with your garden, just let me know." "Thank you," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone his age. "I am Maplewood, I must say. Your garden is beautiful." A strange smile curled his lips. "Yes, it is. Took years to get it just right." As the days passed, I often found myself watching Mr. Graves tend to his plants. There was something mesmerizing about the way he moved through the garden, almost as if he were in communion with it. Sometimes, I thought I saw shadows flitting through the foliage, but I always dismissed it as a trick of the light. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I decided to take a closer look at the garden. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. The air was thick with the scent of blooming flowers and a faint, sweet fragrance I couldn't quite place. I slipped through the gap in the hedge that separated our properties and entered the garden. The plants seemed to close in around me, their leaves rustling softly as if whispering secrets. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I pressed on, drawn deeper into the greenery. As I wandered, I noticed strange things. The flowers seemed to turn towards me, their petals quivering in anticipation. The shadows I had dismissed before now seemed to take on more definite shapes, darting just out of sight. I stumbled upon a small, ornate bench and sat down, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. That's when I heard a soft, almost inaudible whispering. It seemed to come from all around me, the plants swaying in response. I strained to hear, but the words were just beyond my comprehension. Goosebumps prickled my skin, and I decided it was time to leave. As I stood up, something cold brushed against my ankle. I looked down to see a vine slowly coiling around my leg. Panic surged through me, and I kicked at it, but it tightened its grip. I reached down and tore it away, stumbling back towards the hedge. I burst through the gap and ran into my house, slamming the door behind me. My heart was racing, and my mind was reeling with what I had just experienced. I peered out the window, half expecting to see Mr. Graves watching me, but the garden was still, bathed in the last light of the setting sun. That night, sleep eluded me. My dreams were filled with visions of the garden, the flowers whispering dark secrets, and the shadows closing in. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. The next morning, I resolved to confront Mr. Graves. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with his garden. I walked over and knocked on his door. After a few moments, he answered, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Graves, I need to talk to you about your garden," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Ah, yes, the garden. It is a way of getting under your skin, doesn't it?" he replied, his eyes gleaming with a strange light. "What's going on in there?" Last night, I felt like I was being watched, and something tried to grab me. He sighed and gestured for me to follow him. We walked through his house and out into the garden. In the daylight, it looked almost normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. "There are things in this world, Miss Leela, that defy explanation," he began. "This garden is one of them. It's alive in a way you can't imagine." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He led me to a secluded corner of the garden, where a large, ancient tree stood. Its gnarled branches twisted into the sky, and its roots snaked across the ground like serpents. "This tree is the heart of the garden. It's been here for centuries, long before this house was built. It feeds off the energy of those who tend to it, and in return, it gives life to the plants." I stared at the tree, feeling a mix of awe and fear. "Feeds off their energy. What does that mean?" Mr. Graves looked at me, his eyes sad. "It means that those who care for the garden become a part of it. Their life force is intertwined with the plants. That's why the flowers seem so vibrant, the shadows so lively. The garden is a reflection of its keeper." A chill ran through me as I realized the implications. "And what happens to the keeper?" He smiled, a weary, resigned smile. "They become one with the garden. Their essence lingers, sustaining it." I took a step back, horror dawning on me. You mean, you re-trapped here? In a sense, but it's not as bad as it sounds. The garden is beautiful, isn't it? I couldn't deny that, but the beauty was tainted now, twisted into something sinister. I can't stay here, I said, backing away. You've already felt its pull, he warned. Leaving won't be easy. I ran, not looking back, not stopping until I was safely inside my house. I locked the doors and closed the blinds, but I could still feel the garden's presence, a dark, looming shadow at the edge of my mind. Days turned into weeks, and I did everything I could to avoid the garden. But the dreams persisted, the whispers grew louder, and the shadows in my house seemed to move on their own. The garden was calling to me, and I feared that, like Mr. Graves, I was doomed to answer. In the end, I packed my bags and left, abandoning the house and the garden. I moved to the city, far away from the whispers and the shadows. But even here, in the concrete jungle, I can feel it. The garden of shadows has taken root in my mind, and no matter how far I run, I know I'll never truly escape.